everybody, today we're starting quarter 4, lesson 2, and we're going to focus on the Cold War at home. So by the end of today's lesson, you will be able to analyze the impact of the Cold War on the United States, both economically as well as socially. So a couple key terms to keep in mind as we go through this that we talked about in our last lesson, but I just wanted to reiterate. The first one is containment, the idea of stopping the spread of communism, making sure that we contain communism to where it's already at. The second is brinkmanship, existing near a state of war so that each side would take great care not to upset the balance of peace, meaning that there were all the countries knew that they were at peace at the moment, and so they were very cautious and careful on maintaining that peace. The domino theory is this idea or concept that once one country fell to communism, the other ones would. Massive retaliation, using the threat of complete war to keep peace. So using the threat of using nuclear warheads, essentially, to keep peace. And then the arms race, which was a rapid buildup of weapons and military to deter any sort of attack. So the 1950s in the United States, what was it like to live in America in the 1950s? Well, on one side, you had this suburban lifestyle, right? It was the post-war boom, meaning economic boom. People had stable jobs. People had money. They could buy a home in the suburbs. This over here to the right is your picture of Levittown, which was one of the first suburbs. Houses were built to all kind of look the same. You can kind of see they all have very similar characteristics. They were affordable. People were able to move their families into a home. But overlurking this idea of this like suburban lifestyle was this fear of nuclear war. And so we started to see bomb shelters being built. They also would do nuclear war drills. So duck and cover, you might have seen that video. If you watch the videos after this, you'll see a little duck and cover video. Now, this was only one aspect of life, right? There was a full other aspect of life that was happening in the 1950s parallel to the suburban lifestyle, and that was the civil rights movement. So these Levittown affordable suburbs were essentially for whites, right? And this is what began the white flight, where white people moved to the suburbs and African Americans were left in the urban cities. We're going to talk in great depth about this in a couple lessons. We're going to spend a whole lesson on the civil rights movement and go a lot further into what life was like for Americans during the civil rights movement as well. So I'm not going to spend a ton of time on it right here, but just knowing that there were these two parallels at the same time of this white suburban post-war boom, everything looks great, and then at the same time, a ton of inequality and racism taking place. McCarthyism was part of this 1950s society and lifestyle. McCarthyism was named after a senator named Senator Joseph McCarthy. And essentially, he played on the fears of communism with Americans. He accused many officials, people, of being communism with very little evidence. So we saw during this time period a lot of journalists, educators, and entertainers. This was a big deal in Hollywood. Lost their jobs. This lasted for a number of years, but eventually people saw into this. Again, there was very little evidence. It was based on rumor or guilt. So eventually people saw that he wasn't being truthful, and they took away his power. So there were a number of years where people were very fearful, but overall, they were... The race of advancement between the United States and the Soviet Union was a race to see who could advance further faster. And this happened in two areas: the space race, who could enter into space and orbit first, and the arms race, who could build bigger and more destructive nuclear warheads. We're going to start with the space race when the Soviet Union launched Sputnik in 1957. It was a satellite. And this took the United States by surprise. The United States was not expecting the Soviet Union to have this technology. And so then all of a sudden it was a race in the United States to see how fast they could get a satellite into space. The Soviet Union continued, though, with the launch of the Sputnik 2, which actually carried a live dog on it. And it wasn't until a year and a half later when the U.S. finally launched Explorer 1 satellite. And then started NASA. So NASA started as a result of the space race. In addition to the space race, we also had the arms race. When we talk about the arms race, we're talking about weapons or warheads. The Soviets just developed an atomic bomb. Obviously, the United States had developed one first. We used it during World War II. But the Soviets did eventually gain that technology. Not long after the Soviets developed the atomic bomb, the United States developed the hydrogen bomb, which was much more destructive. And by the end of the Cold War, both countries had arsenals that consisted of over 10,000 warheads. In 1960, we saw the presidential election of John F. Kennedy, who we see over here to the right. It was Kennedy versus Richard Nixon. Something to know about this election is that during the first debate, which was televised, people who watched said Kennedy won. People who listened on the radio said Nixon won. And this is pretty important because it just shows how important TV was during this particular presidential election. Kennedy won the election, and in his 1961 inaugural address, he made two very important quotes that we still hear today. The first being, the United States would pay any price, bear any burden, meet any hardship, support any friend, oppose any foe in order to ensure the survival and the success of liberty. So liberty means freedom, and he's talking about fighting communism. And then again, to continue that theme, the second famous quote is, ask not what your country can do for you, ask what you can do for your country. So essentially, how can you help protect and support your country during this time? During Kennedy's presidential years, we had multiple interactions with Cuba. So Cuba was 90 miles off the coast of Florida. So it's very close. So because it's so close, the United States had a strong interest in Cuba and ensuring that Cuba stayed democratic. So at one point in time, the United States actually supported Fidel Castro. Fidel Castro turned out to be a communist at the time that he was supported by the United States. The United States did not believe he was, but he did turn out to be communist. And in 1959, Fidel Castro took power of Cuba. This caused many Cubans to flee Cuba and come to Florida. And the United States wanted to do something to try to prevent the spread of communism. Remember, we're talking about containment again. And so these exiles, who were the Cubans that left Florida, were eventually trained by the CIA and sent back to Cuba with this idea that they were going to overthrow the Castro government, right? That they were going to try to overthrow and become a democratic country. This whole thing was called the Bay of Pigs, and it happened in 1961, so 2 years after Fidel Castro entered into power. However, this failed miserably. It was not successful. Everybody was either killed or captured. It set up a hostile relationship between the United States and Cuba. It did not work. And so this led to increased suspicion on both sides over the spread of communism. So in response to the Bay of Pigs, the Soviet Union decided to retaliate. And so they placed missiles on Cuba. So here you can see the island of Cuba. And this is where the missile sites were, right? Once the United States found out about these missiles, there were 13 days where we were essentially on, quote unquote, the brink of nuclear war. So we knew that there were missiles in Cuba. We knew that these missiles had the ability to reach certain parts of the United States. We knew that we wouldn't have a lot of notice once these missiles were fired. And so for 13 days, when the United States and the Soviet Union were negotiating, we were essentially on the brink of nuclear war. It wasn't until the Soviet Union sent ships to Cuba and the United States had set up a blockade of ships around Cuba that this eventually came to a head until the Soviet Union pulled their ships and turned around. And eventually the Soviet Union removed their missiles out of Cuba. So President Kennedy saw this as a huge success, especially after the failed Bay of Pigs invasion. You can, if you want to see a movie on it, there's a movie called 13 Days. It's a little bit of an older movie, but it is a movie about the Cuban Missile Crisis. And finally, the impact of the Cold War on Virginia's economy. Virginia benefited quite a bit from the Cold War because of the Pentagon and naval bases in Hamilton. It increased a lot of job opportunities here, as well as a lot of revenue just in building and creating these things that all were results of the Cold War.